All right, good morning, Faith. How are we today? Are we good? All right, Pastor Paul is, he's down in, I think, Roxborough. That's an area, one of the suburbs, I think. Rich Sparling, who is one of our ministries that we support, he took a little church in that area, and Pastor Paul's preaching his installation service this morning. So we're on our own, and I'm going to have you go to the book of Ruth. I want to walk you through what is probably one of my favorite, although I think I say that a lot, like, oh, this is my favorite text, or this is my favorite story in the Bible, because there's so many that I love. But I really want to walk you through what is one of my favorite texts and stories and narratives, particularly in the Old Testament, and that is the book of Ruth. And I'm going to give you an overview. Oftentimes, when I have the opportunity to speak to you, it's picking a text that I've particularly been challenged with or that I've previously taught. There's so much in the book of Ruth, so many themes that I'd love to park on and talk about that I just don't have time. So I want to give you a big picture perspective of the whole Ruth narrative and kind of give you the large viewpoint there. If I don't get through the whole thing today, then I'm going to be back in February, toward the end of February, and we'll finish it up. So we'll just see how we go today. But go with me to the book of Ruth, chapter 1. And I want you to begin reading with me in verse 1. It says this: "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." And so I want you to stop right there, because we have some significant background to this story. We know that it is the time of the what? Time of the judges, right? Now, based on what you know of Scripture, and based on what you know of the book of Judges, was the book of Judges a high point or a low point in the history of the nation of Israel? High or low? What do you think? All right. We know that it was a low point, particularly because the book of Judges itself describes this time period as a time in which every man did what? That which was right in his own eyes. So anytime you have a nation or people that's like, hey, I'm going to do what I think is right, it's not going to go well. All right? Sound familiar? A little bit, maybe? That was the nation of Israel at this time. We also know the second thing is that there was a famine in the land. Now, particularly under the old Mosaic covenant that the nation of Israel was in, we know that the famine in the land was generally a sign of God's judgment upon His people. So God's in a covenant relationship with a nation called Israel, and so there's a famine in the land. And so the rains have stopped, the crops are weak, there's not a lot of food, and so Israel's struggling. A man of Bethlehem in Judah. We all know of that place, right? Bethlehem, coincidentally translated the house of bread, is now without bread, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. So we have this background to this story. We've got an Israelite family living in Bethlehem of Judah. The famine's in the land, and so this guy Elimelech says, we got to get out. So we're going to leave Bethel or Bethlehem, the house of bread, and we're going to go somewhere else. It's interesting that they leave the land of promise. They leave this land that God had delivered over to them and that God had promised to them and gave to them. They leave the land, and we can debate and talk about, okay, was Elimelech right or wrong in leaving? That's a tough one, okay? Part of me says, I don't like the fact that he left, because this was God's promised land, and as long as you were faithful to obeying the covenant and the commands that God had given, in other words, Israel swore all of these things we will do, and obviously they weren't doing all of those things that they had promised, and so God was dealing with them through the time of the judges, and so rather than staying faithful in the land that God had given them, He says, we're going to leave. And where does he head? He heads to the country of Moab. Now, Moab is an interesting place. It's a pagan country. There was a lot of strife between the Israelites and the Moabites. They had a lot of history. Now, how many of you know where the Moabites came from? All right. There was we got a couple of you. I'll share with you. There was a man named Lot. Y'all know of Lot? The nephew of Abraham, right? Lot heads to what city? Sodom, right? And there he stays in Sodom, and you know the story if you've been in church. The messengers of God come, the angels come, and God is going to destroy Sodom because of its wickedness. And so God's going to deal with the city of Sodom. He's going to judge it. He's going to destroy it. And so he tells Lot to get out. And after a number of events that take place, Lot leaves the city of Sodom. And as he's leaving, God is destroying the city. And we know what happens to Lot's wife, right? She turns back. She's like, oh, my city. And then God's like, you're salt. And so, there goes Lot's wife. And so it's Lot and his 2 daughters, and so they live in a cave. All right? So he was afraid to go anywhere else, so he's like, we're going to live in a cave. And a really tragic thing happens. The daughters of Lot commit incest with their father to keep the family line going. And from that incestuous relationship comes this man-child named Moab and a nation of people that we come to find in Ruth chapter 1 are the Moabites. So that's where the people of Moab came from, that incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. So you can imagine how the Israelite people felt about the Moabites, right? I mean, if we read in the New Testament how they looked at the Samaritans as half-breeds, imagine how in the Old Testament they looked at the Moabites. But this is where Abimelech decides to take his family. Interesting decision. And my guess is Elimelech went there because there was no famine there. And so we see nothing in the text of Elimelech going to God and asking God for wisdom, asking God for direction. All we see is Elimelech saying, I got to get out of here, and we're going to go where it's easier. So Elimelech left where it was a little bit hard, and he traveled and he went to where it was easy. And that's the tendency for us a lot of times, isn't it? Like, it's difficult here, it's hard here. Forget the fact that God's called me here, but it's hard. You know, what we want to do is we want to get out of those situations that are difficult, and what we want to do is we just want to find ourselves in a place where it's easy. Isn't that our tendency? Like, that's what we want to do. That's what we want to kind of go. And I find myself at times like, man, if it would be easier if God didn't do this, or if God did this, and if I was over here, it would be easier. But oftentimes we have to realize, where has God called you? Where has God placed you? What marriage has God put you in? What family has He put you in? What job has He put you in? So there's all of these things in life where sometimes it gets hard, sometimes it gets difficult, and sometimes we forget to ask God, why have you placed me here? But rather what we do is we're like, I got to get out of here. I got to go somewhere else. I got to go somewhere new. I got to go somewhere where it's going to be easier, don't we? That was Elimelech. Elimelech's like, it's hard here. There's a famine. We're going to go to Moab. And so we have his family introduced. This is all introductory. Notice how Hebrew literature, when you see facts just being listed like that, it's all introductory material before the story even begins. And so in this introduction, it's important to understand he does have a wife. Her name is Naomi. He has 2 sons. One is Mahlon, one is Chilion. The interesting translation for the names of his sons, and names in the ancient Near East carried significance. If there was a meaning behind a name, there was a reason for that. I mean, we sometimes look up the meanings of our names. Like, my name is Doug, and so I think the meaning has something to do with dark waters. I don't know what that's all about, but it really has no significance, I don't think, in our culture. But in the Hebrew, maybe it does, I don't know. But in the Hebrew culture, particularly, the meaning of names was huge. And so Mahlon means weak. Chilion means sickly. So obviously these 2 sons maybe had some health issues. We're not sure, but he's like, hey, weak, sickly, come here. Like, they probably got beat up a lot. I don't know. Based on their names, they didn't have a lot going for them. But anyway, this was his family. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Now, what I want to do is I want to draw you into this narrative, okay? All right, I want you to journey with me into this narrative, because oftentimes what happens when we're reading scriptures, particularly the introductory material where it's like it's going really fast, there's like, okay, there was a man, there was a famine, he left, he died. We're like, okay, where's this going? But stop for a minute, okay? How many of you have ever lost a spouse? Raise your hand. You've lost a spouse. I want you to raise your hand. That's tough, isn't it? Like, think about it. Like put yourself in Naomi's situation. She moves. How many of you have ever moved before and you had to start all over? New friends, you're lonely, you don't know anybody. Okay, so she moves to a foreign country. It's not like she moved to a different town. She moved to a foreign country. And her husband dies. Like, sit there for a second and try and just understand what Naomi was wrestling with. She lost her husband. And those of you that have lost a spouse, you know exactly what that's like. And it stinks, doesn't it? Like that is hard. And so Naomi's there, and she just lost her husband. So she's in a country, it's a pagan country, it's a foreign country, and her husband's dead. But she has her 2 sons, so life goes on, right? Verse 4, her sons took Moabite wives. Right or wrong? Probably not. Probably not a good idea, right? Okay. Under keeping with the covenant that Israel had sworn to God, they were not to marry. So took Moabite wives, but this is what they did. So when you remove yourself, like you remove yourself from God's promise, you remove yourself from the teaching of God, you remove yourself, which is what they did. They removed themselves from the covenant people of God, which is what they were. They removed themselves from that, found themselves with a pagan people, and all of a sudden they're taking these Moabite wives. See, what you're going to find in the book of Ruth is it's a tremendous, tremendous story of grace. Because you've got people making mistake after mistake after mistake. And what you can do is you can look at what's happening so far and say, aha, God's judging them, or God's dealing with them. Had they not gone and had Elimelech not moved his family to this country, had he stayed faithful in Bethlehem, but God wouldn't have done these things. And I think you got to be careful about going down that road. Okay, saying, well, God did this. If you remember Pastor Paul's message, I think it was last week, where that issue came up with Jesus. Like, remember the Tower of Siloam, did that fall on these guys because they were worse sinners? And Jesus is like, no. And so they take 2 Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. So about 10 years passes. And they're getting over the loss of Elimelech. They're moving on. The sons are able to purchase property. They're able to maintain the land. They're able to grow crops. They're able to have a family and have existence. And they're doing okay. They've suffered a great loss, but they're doing all right. It's been 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died. Wow. Now put yourself in Naomi's situation. She's in a foreign country. She's been there 10 years. She's lost her husband. Now she's lost not one of her children, but both of her children. How many of you have lost a child before? Raise your hand. It's tough, isn't it? I mean, some of you raised your hand for both spouse and child. So you can identify with Naomi, can't you? Others of you can't so much. But as much as you can, put yourself in her situation. She is a widow in the ancient Near East in a foreign country, which means for her, she cannot own land. Women weren't allowed to own and operate lands and businesses. She's got 2 daughters-in-law that can't own and operate a business or land. She has lost her wealth. She has lost her family. She's lost it all. So before we get into the text and get too harsh on Naomi, think for a minute what she's gone through. She has lost her 2 sons, both of them. Have you ever been in a situation where life has gone a certain way and you've maybe gone through a number of difficulties and it seems like you've just had a history of difficulty, and then something else happens and you're like, seriously? You ever had that conversation with God where you're like, come on! Seriously, God? You ever been there? Like I have, and I haven't even experienced the type of loss that Naomi has. Like I've gone through different things in life where I'm like, well, I've looked up and said, seriously, God, you're going to do this now? So what we're going to see in this text is there's going to be a tremendous amount of conflict. And it is the conflict in the Hebrew narratives that drives these stories. And what we're going to find is there is a tremendous amount of conflict going to be developing between Naomi and God. How many of you have ever been mad at someone before? We can be honest and raise our hands. How many of you have ever been mad? Okay. Awesome. And be honest and raise your hand if this is true. How many of you have ever been mad at God before? My hand is up because I have been. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying human emotion. Sometimes I have gotten to the point, and I'm a pretty passionate individual. I'm a pretty, and so sometimes it's been like, God, I don't know that you understand what you're doing right now. Because if I were in control, I would be doing things a lot differently. You ever had that conversation with God? Like, that's human nature. That's where we find ourselves sometimes, right? You ever had conflict with God before? Of course you have. Everyone in this room, if you're a believer, if you're a follower of Christ, if you're not, you definitely have conflict with God. But I'm speaking to those who know Christ. Naomi was part of God's covenant people. She was about to have some serious conflict with her God. And we've all found ourselves there, haven't we? God does things in our lives that we don't like. We think He's made a mistake, even though we wouldn't out loud say that. Sometimes it's like, God, I don't know that you know what you're doing. This is where Naomi finds herself. And so what happens is this. The text is amazing. It says, she rose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So the famine is over. I'm heading back home, Naomi says. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. And so there's this confrontation that happens as she's like, Orpah, Ruth, I'm heading home. You stay in the land of Moab. You marry husbands and find a life. And they push the issue a little. No, Naomi, we're committed to you, and you got to hand it to them. We want to stay faithful. We want to stay committed to you, our mother-in-law. Now notice Naomi's perspective here, because you're about to see Naomi's heart a little bit opened up right here. Verse 11, but Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope. Let's stop there a second. Naomi had found herself in a place where she had lost all what? All hope. Like, that's a dark place to be, isn't it? Like she's just sitting there saying, if I had any hope at all, if I could tell you I had any hope at all, even if I should have a husband this night and bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. I don't know that I've ever been like in this like this hopeless, dark place that Naomi found herself. But if you listen to what she says, it is exceedingly, not just bitter, exceedingly bitter that what? The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Look at what God did to me. And she turns to Orpah, she turns to Ruth, and she says, if you come with me, there is no future for you with me. None. No future, no hope. God's hand has gone out against me. I have nothing. Therefore, for you to come with me means for you no future at all, no hope. She was in an absolutely desperate, hopeless, dark situation. This is where Naomi found herself. And I know that the struggle for each and every Christian from time to time will be to go here because of circumstances in life that are difficult. Am I right? So what is it at the end of the day that keeps you from going here? That keeps you from, that struggle she was having with God. She looks at God and she says, God, the Lord Yahweh has gone out, his hand is against me. And they lifted up their voices, verse 14, and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back. Return. And then you have some of the famous sayings of Ruth. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Now notice real carefully what Ruth is saying. I know this is a familiar text, and it's usually used at weddings, but it's not maybe the best wedding text. Okay? Because what Ruth is about to say is incredibly significant to the story. Ruth says, your people will be my people. Was Ruth an Israelite? No. She was a Moabite. So for her to say, your people will be my people, for her was meaning what? Ruth was turning her back on her upbringing. She was turning her back on her family. She was turning her back on her nation. She was turning her back on everything that she had known up to that point to embrace the Israelite people. Now, why in the world would Ruth do that? Was it simply because she just had this incredible loyalty to Naomi? Was that what drove her? I just want to be faithful. A lot of times that's the way it's looked at. Like, oh, Naomi just, was her mother-in-law. Ruth was just faithful to the end. So be faithful. I don't know that had as much to do with it. I'm not saying Ruth wasn't faithful. I'm sure she was incredibly faithful to her. But what was it that at the end of the day that drove Ruth to say, I am leaving all of this, and I'm going to embrace this, even though you say the future with you is dark and bitter. And who wants to hang out with that person? You know what I mean? Like, oh, God's hand is against me, and everything, and I have no hope, and there's just like deep, dark depression. You know what I mean? Like generally, that's not the type of person that you're like, yeah, let's hang out and do something. Like they're hurting, and a lot of times what we do is, honestly, we try to kind of keep our distance from those type of people, don't we? Because they got issues, right? This is why I can't understand how Ron does it every single day, day in, day out. I mean, people that are struggling like Naomi, just counseling them. I mean, you got to have a gift for that, because oftentimes what we want to do is we kind of want to shield ourselves from, because those people have real pain, and right now things are okay for me, and so if I get too involved in their lives, what will happen? Some of their mess will spill over into my life, and I'll have to actually sacrifice a little bit so that I can. And so Ruth deciding to stay with Naomi was incredibly significant. And so I'm not going to say, I'm sure there was love, there was commitment, there was care for Naomi. But at the end of the day, what was it that caused Ruth to abandon everything she had known, to embrace this new lifestyle of poverty? And that's what it was. It was two widows in the ancient Near East with nothing. Poverty. That's what it was. Well, I'm going to leave everything I've known, and I'm going to embrace a life of poverty with my bitter mother-in-law. Who's signing up for that? Right? But your people, they'll be my people. And here's the significant phrase I want you to focus on. And she says what? Your God will be my God. What happened in Ruth's life? she had an encounter with the God of heaven. She became a follower of the Israelite God, Yahweh. We know him today as Jesus. And so being married to the family of Elimelech, I'm sure she heard of the Israelite history of how God had delivered them from Egypt, how God had delivered them into the land of Canaan, how God was with them. She was very familiar, I'm sure, because of Naomi. I can't imagine that Naomi hadn't told her, yeah, we are God's covenant people. We are in a relationship with the God of heaven, and He has called us His own. You know what I mean? Naomi knew that. Naomi understood that. They lived in Bethlehem, and then they left that. But at some point in her life, Ruth had an encounter with God. At some point in her life, Ruth said, I'm abandoning my past to embrace a new life with the God of heaven. And she wanted to consider, even though she was nationally a Moabite person, she says, I consider myself a part of God's covenant people. And that's the amazing thing of God's grace, that even under the Old Covenant, this is amazing, even under the Old Covenant, someone who was outside of the national people of Israel could be brought in spiritually and be considered the people of God, and that's Ruth. Because Ruth's salvation, Ruth's faith was not ultimately based upon an old covenant, but we know now based upon what? A new covenant that Christ would institute with His blood. And so Ruth became a follower of the God of the universe, of the true and living God. She abandoned her pagan idols. She abandoned all that she had been taught to embrace her new relationship with Yahweh. And therefore, she says, in order to follow the path that God's laid out, in order to follow that, I've got to leave this and I've got to embrace this. And so there was a deep level of commitment to Naomi, but my argument to you this morning is that there was a deeper level of commitment to God. And therefore she says, my commitment to you is lifelong. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord so do to me, and more also, if anything but death parts us. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Naomi was like, I'm not going to talk her out of this. All right, let's go. So the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. So they're on this journey, two widow women. They come to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Okay, so there's a stir, all right? Naomi's back. And she's got this woman, this Moabite woman with her. And I love the text because it's like, so all the women get together, right? And I guess I can imagine, all right? Like the women are like, you know, that women talk sometimes. I know I'm stereotyping, but humor me for a minute. Women, I can just imagine, like, is that Naomi? Did you see Naomi's back? Like, it's been at least 10 years. And so there's a lot, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? And so it's like the women are like, this is Naomi, look at her, Naomi's back. What's going on with Naomi? I know, I heard she's back. Let's go talk to her. So all of a sudden the women, okay, so the Naomi, you're back. Welcome back, Naomi, right? Naomi said to them, don't call me Naomi. Like Naomi is angry. She's bitter. There's depression there. Like she is wrestling with God. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Who is she blaming? She's blaming God, isn't she? She's angry at God. She's mad at God. There's conflict with God there. She's like, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full. Okay, so let's park there for a second. I went away full. So her definition of full was what? Had family. I had wealth. Had everything I needed. So this is where I think a big struggle is going to be for a lot of us, because this is, for us, I think, how we define full, isn't it? For me, full means I have this, and this. Take all of that away and I have nothing. That's where Naomi found herself. When I left, I had everything I needed. Now, here's the question I want to leave with you, because we're not going to get through this whole thing today unless you want to stay for another 2 hours, which I'm willing to do, by the way. I'm good for that, but the children's workers and nursery workers might have an issue. So we'll pick it up at the end of February. This is the question I want to leave. Had God abandoned Naomi? Did he abandon her? No. Now, if you're sitting in church hearing this for the first time, and you don't know the end of the story, your answer might be different, because you might be looking at that saying, no, God actually, it looks pretty much like she was abandoned. Went to another country, there goes your husband, there goes your sons, there goes everything. You ever felt abandoned by God before? Like this is where Naomi found herself. I've lost everything. When I left, I had everything. Now when I'm back, I have nothing. Was that true? No. Why? Because God had not abandoned Naomi. As dark as her days were, as difficult as life was, as much pain as she was feeling, God had not abandoned her. Yet there is so many times in life where we feel that, don't we? Like, God, where are you? Like, hello, I'm here, God, I'm hurting, I'm struggling, I have needs. Do you even care? You ever been there? And so you pray, and you pray some more, and you go to church, and you start doing all of the things that you think you should be doing, and then you step back and you say, okay, God, I tried all of that and it didn't work. You ever been there? Like, I think that's kind of this cycle that we go through. You know what I mean? We kind of go in circles. We're like, well, if I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I pray even more, then God's going to take away my problems. God's going to take away the difficult circumstances. When in reality, God may have a very, very specific reason for doing in your life what He's doing. In fact, I'm not going to say He may. He does have a reason for doing that. We know and see even in the New Testament that God does work all things together for good, which is a horrible verse to share with someone who's really struggling, okay? Because you know that. You know? And so when someone comes up, hey, brother, all things will work together for good, you want to punch them in the face and say, well, that must have been for your good then, huh? Right? You ever been there? Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations and struggles. It's like, I don't... So there's these theological truths we know to be true. And it doesn't always match up with what we're experiencing, right? And so while we may know in our minds God has not abandoned us, at times it sure feels that way, doesn't it? Like, God, you're not answering my prayers. God, you're not giving me strength. God, you're not giving me victory. God, you're not bringing me out of this depression. God, you know what I mean? I prayed so much, that God would remove this. I prayed so much that God would do this. And I prayed so much that God would take away this pain, and He just hasn't yet. And so the natural feeling is God's abandoned me. That's where Naomi was. She felt abandoned by God, because it's going to go on to say, she says, I went away full, came back empty. So we have to define what real fullness means. What does it really mean to be full? And I'll say this. Being full is tied less to material, temporal possessions, and being full is tied way more to the gospel. What is it that if God took it away today, you would feel empty? See, we have to redefine what it means to be full. And being full has everything to do with understanding the gospel. And we'll get there. I went away full, the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified? There's another accusation. So this is the third accusation we see. We say, the first accusation, the hand of the Almighty is against me. The second accusation is the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. The third accusation is Yahweh has testified against me. And then the fourth accusation, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. So here you have fourfold accusation that Naomi keeps pointing the finger to God, saying, God did this to me, God did this to me, God did this to me, God did this to me. I'm bitter, and I'm angry, and you better believe I'm upset because God's abandoned me. That's where Naomi finds herself. So Naomi returned, verse 22, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So chapter 1 is a devastating chapter, isn't it? Chapter 1 is that chapter that leaves us feeling as though God has abandoned us, leaving Naomi feeling as though God has abandoned her. But chapter 2 is going to come. And what we're going to find, and I'll pick this up and we'll finish it the next time I speak at the end of February, is we're going to see that God had a perfect plan through all of the difficulty that Naomi was going through, that God had a plan. That at the times in which it seemed as though God had abandoned Naomi, what God was actually doing was God was actually working out His sovereign plan in her life to produce something far greater than Naomi could have ever expected. And so what I want to leave you with is this, is just kind of the whole idea of what this narrative leads us to. And that's when difficulty and hard circumstances in life begin to cloud our vision of who God is and what He's promised to us. So in other words, all I see is difficulty, and it clouds my vision of what I know to be true, is that in the midst of that, even though it may not feel like it, even though it may not seem like it, in the midst of that, you have to anchor yourself to something that is true. And that is this: there is a sovereign God who has not abandoned you, but rather is producing within you what is necessary so that ultimately He can produce something in your life that will be far greater than anything you could have possibly imagined. But sometimes that comes by walking a road that you never wanted to walk in the first place. And some of you that have walked down that road already, you can look back and you can testify, wow, at the time I didn't see what God was doing. But now maybe I can see a little bit of what He's doing. I can see that through that He produced this. Through that, He did this. Through that, this person came to Christ. But you know what's really hard, guys? Some of you have walked down that road and you still can't see why God did that. Like you're sitting here today, you're like, not me, Doug. I still don't know why God did that. See, the beauty of this narrative is the fact that we're going to see why God did everything He did. And it's a glorious ending. Like the ending, I'll just give you a hint. Because you can go, it ends with the birth of a child. Which it's just going to be, it's an amazing story. And then you can see how God was weaving circumstances through Naomi's life to bring forth a child that would be born. But you may be saying, Doug, I've gone down the road, I'm looking back, and I still can't see why God did that. And the only thing I can tell you this morning is this: you have to anchor yourself to something you know to be true, and that's the gospel. That Christ in love paid for your sin, brought you into His family, calls you His own, is in a covenant relationship with you, and as such, He has not abandoned you. And you may not know until you reach the other side of this life the reason why God did some of the things in your life now that He's doing. You may not know in this life. But I tell you what, that day when you reach heaven, and you see the face of Christ, and you see what God was ultimately doing through that, you're going to know. And you're going to worship. The hard part is worshiping now, isn't it? So understand this, that God, with design and purpose in His sovereignty, orchestrates all circumstances of our lives ultimately to accomplish His purpose. The beauty is you get to be a part of that. And God has promised never to abandon you.